They locked her out of her own house, so she bought the one no one wanted. And her dog uncovered why. The locksmith didn't look at her. He just changed the locks while her son stood there, arms folded, saying it was temporary. Marianne Caldwell left that driveway with one suitcase and a German shepherd who refused to stop watching the door. 2 days later, she spent $42 on a vine-choked cabin at the edge of Morgan Hollow. Because when everything is taken, sometimes you buy what's been forgotten. If you were standing in that driveway, would you walk away quietly or start over somewhere no one else believed in? The locksmith didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the door. On the brass cylinder he was unscrewing like it was just another Tuesday job. His toolbox sat open on the front steps, metal latches catching the gray afternoon light. The air smelled faintly of rain and fallen leaves. Marianne Caldwell stood at the end of her own driveway and tried to remember when the house had stopped being hers. The maple tree in the yard was already half bare. Its leaves skittered across the concrete every time the wind picked up. She had planted that tree the year Evan turned 10. Daniel had complained about the roots near the foundation, but he dug the hole anyway. Now the front door was open, and a stranger's back filled the frame. "You're almost done?" Evan asked. He stood on the porch, arms folded tight across his chest. His coat looked new, too new for someone who said he was buried in debt. "Just a minute," the locksmith replied without turning around. Marianne watched her son's face. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Not since the bank letter arrived. Not since the lawyer used words like liability and collateral and unfortunate circumstance. 2 years ago, Evan had sat at her kitchen table with a stack of papers and a careful smile. "It's just refinancing, Mom. It protects the house from estate taxes down the line. It's smarter this way." She had signed because he was her son, because he looked tired, because Daniel had always told her, "Help him when he asks. Pride runs in that boy." The wind picked up again. Ranger shifted closer to her leg. He was 3 years old, broad chest, black saddle across his back. His ears were upright now, alert, but his body was still. Watching. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He just studied the porch. The locksmith pulled the old lock free and dropped it into a small plastic bag. Metal clinked against metal. The sound carried. "That's it," the man said. "New keys are set." Evan nodded. "Thanks." He paid in cash. Marianne's stomach tightened at that. Cash. Her suitcase sat beside her on the curb. One navy blue roller bag, the same one she'd taken on church trips and summer visits to her sister in Indiana. It looked smaller now. "Mom," Evan said finally, stepping down off the porch, "I didn't know it would go this way. The investors pulled out. The business just collapsed. They had to seize assets. The house was part of it." "The house did so," she repeated softly. He winced. "It's temporary," he added quickly. "We'll figure something out." She nodded once. Temporary. The locksmith closed his toolbox and walked past her with a polite, almost embarrassed glance. He didn't know the story. To him, this was a job. Change the locks. Drive away. A neighbor's curtain shifted across the street. Marianne felt the weight of that movement like a hand on her shoulder. Ranger pressed his flank lightly against her calf, grounding. "Where are you going?" Evan asked. "I'll manage," she said. That was all. She did not want to stand here explaining herself, did not want sympathy or advice or the kind of looks that linger too long. The front door closed with a soft click. A new sound. Not hers. Marianne bent down and picked up the handle of her suitcase. It felt heavier than it should have. Ranger walked at her side as she moved toward her old sedan parked at the curb. She paused once. Just once. Not to cry. The tears had already come earlier. Quiet ones, in the bathroom, while folding clothes into that single bag. She looked at the windows, the lace curtains she'd hemmed herself. The porch swing Daniel had reinforced after it cracked one summer. The dent in the garage door from when Evan misjudged the brake pedal at 16. The house looked exactly the same. That felt unfair. "Come on, Ranger," she murmured. He obeyed instantly, trotting beside her as she opened the trunk. He jumped into the back seat when she opened the door, turning once before settling. His eyes never left the house. Marianne slid behind the wheel. Her hands rested there for a moment. They were steady. That surprised her. Evan stood near the porch steps, shifting his weight like he wanted to say something else. Apologize, explain, ask forgiveness. Asked. He didn't. She started the engine. The sound of it filled the quiet street. No one waved. No one came outside. She pulled away slowly, careful to clip the mailbox. At the end of the block, she checked the rearview mirror. The house grew smaller. The maple tree blurred. She told herself not to look again. Ranger leaned forward between the seats and rested his chin on her shoulder. His breath was warm. "I know," she whispered. The road curved out of the subdivision and toward the highway. The sky hung low, heavy with a coming storm. Traffic lights blinked yellow at the main intersection. Marianne didn't have a destination yet. Only distance. Distance from the driveway. Distance from the sound of that lock clicking into place. She drove with both hands on the wheel, eyes forward. Ranger stayed close, his weight shifting gently with every turn. The house was gone now, but the echo of it stayed with her, and somewhere beneath the shock, beneath the humiliation she would not name aloud, something else began to settle. Not hope. Not yet. Just a quiet, stubborn refusal to disappear. The rain started as she merged onto the highway. Soft at first, then steady. The rain followed her all the way out of town. By the time Marianne reached the edge of Morgan County, the sky had settled into a flat sheet of gray. The kind that doesn't threaten thunder. Just wait. She drove without the radio on. Ranger stayed upright in the back seat, watching the road ahead between the front seats. Every now and then, he shifted when she slowed at a curve, adjusting his balance without fuss. She pulled into a gas station off Route 18 just before dusk. The sign flickered. Half the letters burned out. She filled the tank, counted the cash in her wallet afterward. Not much. A small stack folded twice over. Inside the station, a corkboard near the coffee machine caught her eye. County tax auction. Saturday. Properties sold as is Morgan Hollow Courthouse Annex. 10 a.m. She stood there longer than she meant to. The idea didn't arrive as hope. It arrived as calculation. She had enough to stay in a motel for maybe 2 weeks. Maybe less if something unexpected broke. Or she could buy something. Even something broken. Even something no one else wanted. She took a photo of the notice with her phone. Ranger watched her from the car when she came back out, ears forward. "Looks like we're staying local," she said quietly. He didn't react, but his eyes stayed on her face a second longer than usual. The courthouse annex smelled like floor cleaner and old paper. Metal folding chairs lined the back wall. A handful of men in work boots stood near the front, talking in low voices about acreage and hunting rights. A woman in a red coat flipped through a property list with narrowed eyes. Marianne chose a seat near the side wall. Ranger lay down at her feet immediately, front paws crossed, head up. People noticed him. They always did. German shepherds carry a certain presence, even at rest. The auction clerk, a heavy-set man with reading glasses perched low on his nose, adjusted the microphone. "We'll begin with Parcel 14, he said. 2-acre lot off Creekside Road, no structure." Bids went up quickly. Voices rose and fell. Marianne scanned the stapled sheet she'd been handed at the door. Most listings were raw land or collapsed sheds. Then she saw it. Parcel 27. Morgan Hollow 1-story cabin. Uninhabitable. Structural concerns. Water intrusion. No utilities connected. Access road partially eroded. Sold as is. Starting bid, $25. Her fingers paused on the paper. Morgan Hollow. She'd driven past the turnoff once years ago. Daniel had pointed it out. "Old logging country," he'd said. "Most of it's swallowed by trees now." The clerk cleared his throat again. Parcel 27. A few men shifted in their chairs. "Starting at 25. Silence. Someone near the front let out a soft snort. "That place? It's held together by weeds," another voice muttered. 42, Marianne said. The word left her mouth before she could reconsider. The room turned. Not dramatically. Just enough. A couple of men chuckled. The clerk blinked down at his sheet. $42? She nodded once. "Any advance on 42? Nothing. One man scratched his chin, glanced toward the door, then shook his head. "Going once," the clerk said. The microphone hummed. "Going twice." Marianne felt Ranger's shoulder press lightly against her ankle. "Sold. $42. The gavel made a small, hollow sound against the desk. That was it. No applause, no argument. Just paperwork. When she stepped forward to sign, she felt the weight of eyes again. Not cruel, exactly. More puzzled. "Ma'am," the clerk said quietly as he slid the document toward her. "This property hasn't been maintained in over a decade." "I understand." "No water, no electric." "I understand." He hesitated, then lowered his voice further. "Road floods in spring." She met his eyes for the first time. "I understand." He didn't smile, but he didn't laugh either. She signed Marianne Caldwell in steady handwriting. The ink didn't tremble. Ranger stood when she stepped back, staying close to her leg as they walked toward the exit. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky was clearing in strips near the horizon. Morgan Hollow was only 20 miles from town, but the road narrowed quickly once she turned off the highway. Pavement gave way to cracked asphalt, then gravel. Trees leaned inward over the road like they were trying to whisper to each other above her roof. Ranger shifted again in the back seat. Alert, not anxious. She followed the directions printed on the sale sheet. Left at a rusted sign barely legible under moss. Across a shallow dip in the road where water had carved grooves. Then a narrow track that felt less like a driveway and more like a suggestion. She drove slowly. The tires crunched over leaves thick enough to hide the ground beneath. And then she saw it. The cabin. It sat low against the slope of the hill. Smaller than she expected. wrapped almost completely in brown winter vines. The porch rails were barely visible beneath them. The roof sagged slightly in the middle. One shutter hung crooked. No smoke, no lights, no sign of life. The air smelled different here. Colder. Damp bark and old iron. She turned off the engine. Silence pressed in. Even the wind seemed muted. Ranger didn't wait for her command. He stood the moment she opened the door. He stepped out first, paws landing carefully on the leaf-covered ground. His head lifted high, ears forward, scanning. Marianne followed, closing the car door softly behind her. The cabin did not look welcoming. It looked forgotten. Vines climbed the porch posts like ropes binding something in place. Dead leaves were piled against the steps. The windows were dark behind layers of grime. "This is what $42 buys," she murmured. Ranger moved toward the porch but stopped at the bottom step. He studied it. Nose lifted. Then he glanced back at her. Not fearful, just aware. Marianne climbed the first step carefully. The wood creaked under her weight, but held. She reached the door. The lock was rusted but intact. The key the clerk handed her slid in with resistance. She turned it slowly. The door opened with a long, tired groan. Cold air spilled out. Stale. Closed in. She stood there for a moment. Ranger stepped forward first. Inside was dim. Light filtered through gaps in the vines covering the windows. Dust floated in thin beams near the ceiling. The boards underfoot sagged slightly. The stone fireplace was choked with soot and spider webs. A single chair lay tipped over in the corner. No furniture beyond that. No obvious damage beyond age and neglect. She stepped fully inside. The door closed behind her with a soft thud. The sound echoed in a way she hadn't expected. Not hollow. Contained. Ranger walked slowly across the main room, nose sweeping the floor. His nails clicked lightly on the wood. Marianne set her suitcase down near the hearth. It wasn't home. Not yet. But it was something that hadn't been taken from her. And for now, that was enough to keep her standing. Ranger paused in the center of the room, still, watching, as if he already sensed the cabin held more than rot and vines. Ranger stood there, body still, tail low, but not tucked. His ears pivoted slowly, catching something Marianne couldn't hear. The cabin felt thick with silence. Not peaceful, just absorbed. Marianne stepped farther into the room. The floorboards dipped under her weight, soft in places. The smell inside was stronger than outside. Wet wood, old ash, something metallic buried under years of damp air. She moved toward the nearest window and pushed against the vine-laced glass. It didn't budge. The vines were wound tight across the outside like ropes binding a crate. She turned back toward the hearth. The fireplace was built from rough gray stone, blackened with soot that hadn't been disturbed in years. A rusted poker leaned against the wall. The iron grate inside sagged slightly to one side. "This will need cleaning," she murmured. Her voice sounded smaller inside the room. Ranger began to circle, slow, methodical. He sniffed along the perimeter walls first, paused at a darkened corner near the ceiling where cobwebs hung heavy. Then he returned to the center of the room. Marianne unzipped her suitcase and pulled out a folded blanket. She shook it once, sending dust rising from the air itself rather than the fabric. She spread it near the hearth. "Here," she said softly. Ranger didn't come. He remained standing in the middle of the floor, watching. She straightened and glanced around again, taking inventory. One narrow hallway led to what looked like a back room. A door hung crooked on its hinges. The boards along the hallway were more uneven. She walked toward it slowly. The hallway creaked with each step. The sound seemed to travel through the wood rather than above it. The back room was smaller. Bare walls, a single window half covered in ivy. The ceiling sagged slightly in one corner where water had seeped in over time. Nothing else. No furniture. No signs of squatters. Just absence. Marianne returned to the main room. The daylight had shifted outside. Dusk was settling into the valley. The hollow grew darker earlier than the rest of the world. The trees on either side rose steep and close, blocking what little sky remained. She shut the front door firmly. The latch clicked. That sound felt different than the one at her old house. Here, it didn't sound like exclusion. It sounded like enclosure. Ranger finally moved toward the blanket, but didn't lie down. He lowered his head, sniffed once, then turned back toward the center of the room. He walked to a specific section of floor near the stone hearth. Paused. Stared. Marianne followed his line of sight. It was just floorboards, warped, darkened with age. One plank slightly bowed at the edge. She stepped closer. The wood dipped under her foot, but so did others. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Ranger's nose hovered inches above the plank. He inhaled deeply. Once. Twice. Then he shifted his weight and sat beside it. Not on it. Beside it. Facing it. The wind pushed against the outer walls. The vines scraped faintly along the siding. A low dragging sound that made the cabin seem to breathe. Marianne felt the unease rise slowly in her chest. It wasn't fear exactly. It was awareness. She crouched and tapped the plank lightly with her knuckles. Solid enough. She tapped another plank nearby. The sounds were nearly identical. "You're hearing something I'm not," she murmured. Ranger didn't look at her. His focus didn't waver. Outside, a branch snapped somewhere in the trees. The sound echoed sharply in the hollow, and then vanished. No birds followed. No rustle of small animals. The valley swallowed sound quickly. She stood and walked to the fireplace, testing the stones with her hand. Cold. Damp in places. She checked the chimney opening. Blocked with debris but not collapsed. She would need firewood, water, light. The reality of that settled in now. She had bought a structure, not a home. The wind shifted again. The cabin answered with a long creak through the rafters. Ranger stood suddenly and walked back to the plank. This time he lowered himself slowly to the floor and lay beside it, chin resting near the warped edge. Guarding. Marianne watched him for a long moment. "All right," she said softly. "We'll look at it tomorrow." Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. She pulled a small flashlight from her bag and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dimness in a thin white line. Dust motes drifted lazily through the light. She placed a folding chair upright near the hearth and sat. Ranger didn't move. The light outside faded completely. Darkness came fast in Morgan Hollow. It didn't creep. It dropped. The cabin interior turned gray, then shadowed. Marianne kept the flashlight resting on its side, angled upward to bounce light off the ceiling. It softened the harshness. The silence grew heavier as night settled in. No distant traffic. No neighbor's television through walls. just wind and wood. After a while, she rose and tested the door latch again. Secure. She walked back to the center of the room. Ranger's eyes reflected faintly in the flashlight glow. "You're not settling tonight, are you?" she asked. His tail moved once against the floor. Not playful, just acknowledgement. Marianne pulled the blanket around her shoulders and leaned back against the stone of the hearth. The stone was colder than she expected. It drew warmth away quickly. The wind pressed harder against the cabin walls. Somewhere along the siding, the vines scraped in uneven rhythm. The sound traveled across the wood like fingers. Ranger's ears flicked. His head lifted slightly, then lowered again. He did not bark. He did not growl. He remained fixed on that section of floor. Marianne tried to slow her breathing, tried to let the silence settle instead of fight it. The cabin had stood here long before her. It would stand tonight. She watched Ranger until her eyelids grew heavy. Even as sleep pulled at her, she noticed something. He never took his eyes off that plank. Not once. And the hollow outside swallowed every other sound whole. Morning didn't arrive with birdsong. It arrived with pale light slipping through the cracks in the vines, thin and cold. Marianne woke stiff against the hearth, her neck protesting the stone. For a moment she forgot where she was. The silence felt unfamiliar, heavier than her old house ever allowed. Then she saw Ranger. He hadn't moved far. He was still near that same plank, stretched alongside it like he had stood watch all night. His head lifted the moment she stirred. "You didn't sleep much," she murmured. His ears twitched. She stood slowly, joints popping. The air inside the cabin felt sharper in daylight, less mysterious, more exposed. Dust showed itself in full honesty. Cobwebs hung like tired lace in the corners. The sagging boards were easier to see now, their edges slightly misaligned. Ranger rose and immediately returned to the plank. He sniffed once, twice. Then he did something he hadn't done before. He scratched. Not while digging. One paw, firm, direct, a deliberate scrape. The sound cut across the quiet room. Marianne froze. Ranger scratched again. Same spot. She walked over carefully and crouched beside him. "All right," she said softly. "Show me." He stepped back just enough to give her space but didn't leave the area. She pressed her palm against the wood. It felt colder than the surrounding boards. She knocked on it lightly with her knuckles. The sound was different. Not dramatically. Just thinner. She tapped another plank nearby. Thicker, denser. She returned to the first, tapped again, hollow. Her stomach tightened. She looked at Ranger. He was watching her, head slightly tilted. "You heard that before I did," she whispered. She stood and walked to the fireplace, scanning for something she could use as leverage. The rusted poker leaned against the stone, its handle bent but intact. She carried it back to the plank. The wood around the edges looked slightly warped, as if it had shifted over time. A faint gap along one side where dust had settled deeper. She wedged the tip of the poker into that gap, pressed down. The wood resisted at first, then creaked. Ranger's ears went upright. Marianne shifted her grip and applied more pressure. The plank lifted just a fraction of an inch. Enough. She slid her fingers into the gap and pulled. The board came up with a slow, complaining groan, sending a puff of stale air into the room. Cold air rose from beneath. Not fresh, not earthy, metallic. She set the plank aside. Below it, between the joists, was something she hadn't expected. A rusted metal hatch, rectangular, fitted snugly into a framed opening beneath the floorboards. It wasn't large, maybe 2 feet by 3, but it didn't belong in a simple logging cabin. The air in the room shifted. Even the light felt heavier. Ranger leaned forward, nose hovering near the edge, then stopped. He did not touch it. He simply stared. Marianne's heart began to pound in a way she couldn't explain. Not fear exactly. Not yet. But this was no accident. She brushed away the layer of dust coating the metal. Her fingers came away gray. There was a small recessed handle in the center, rusted but intact. She hesitated. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls had leaned closer. She glanced toward the door, still shut, toward the windows. Vines unmoving in the still morning. The hollow remained silent. $42, she murmured under her breath. What did I buy? Ranger's tail gave one slow sweep against the floor. Marianne wrapped her hand around the metal handle. Cold bit into her palm through her skin. She pulled. The hatch didn't move. Rust had sealed it tight. She exhaled slowly, then shifted her grip and tried again. Harder this time. A sharp metallic crack echoed through the cabin. Ranger stepped back half a pace but didn't retreat. The hatch lifted a fraction. More stale air rose from below. She pulled again. This time it came free with a long scraping sound that traveled straight through the floor into the walls. The hollow seemed to answer it with silence. Beneath the hatch was not empty darkness. It was a shallow compartment framed between beams. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth darkened with age, sat a small steel box. Not large, not ornate, practical, deliberate. Marianne stared at it for a long moment. There was no sign of rodents, no debris. It had been placed there carefully. Hidden. Ranger leaned closer, nostrils flaring, then sat down. His job, it seemed, was finished. She reached down and lifted the box. It was heavier than it looked. Cold. The oilcloth crinkled under her fingers as she set it gently on the cabin floor. She brushed dust from the top and saw a simple latch. No padlock, just a clasp folded tight. Her pulse was steady now, not racing, focused. She looked once more toward Ranger. "You don't do things halfway, do you?" she said quietly. His eyes remained on her. Marianne slid her fingers under the latch and lifted. It opened with a small metallic click. She folded back the oilcloth slowly. The lid of the steel box rose with it. Inside were papers. Stacks of them. Yellowed but intact. Bound with twine. Neatly arranged. Not money. Not valuables. Documents. The air in the cabin felt different now. Not haunted. Not yet understood. But something long buried had been disturbed. Marianne reached into the box and lifted the top bundle. Ranger watched her hands. Outside, the hollow remained still, and inside the vine-covered cabin, the silence waited for her to read. Marianne lowered herself onto the floor beside the open hatch. The wood was cold beneath her knees, but she barely noticed. Ranger stayed close, not crowding her, just watching. She untied the twine around the first stack of papers. Land surveys, topographical sketches, old county stamps in faded blue ink. The dates caught her eye first. Her breath slowed. She flipped to the next sheet. A hand-drawn boundary map of Morgan Hollow. Parcel lines traced in red pencil. One section circled. This cabin. Her fingers trembled now, not from fear but from recognition. She pulled out the next bundle. A ledger. Neat handwriting. Familiar. Her chest tightened. Daniel's handwriting had always leaned slightly to the right. Clean, steady strokes. He used block letters for numbers, underlined totals with firm, straight lines. This matched. She pressed her lips together and turned the page. Entries marked with timber yields, truckloads, purchase orders. Then a note written in the margin. Pending acquisition. Verify appraisal discrepancy. Her heart skipped. She hadn't heard that word in years. Acquisition. She set the ledger aside and reached for the final document in the box. Thicker paper. Legal formatting. An unsigned property transfer agreement dated October 12, 1998. The buyer, Green River Development Group. The seller, Marianne Caldwell. Her throat went dry. The signature line was blank. The page behind it included an attached note in Daniel's handwriting. Parcel 27 excluded from bulk acquisition pending review. Excluded. She stared at the words. Excluded. Her mind moved quickly now. 2 years ago, when Evan refinanced her house, the debt had been bundled into something called a regional restructuring package. She hadn't paid attention to the details. She trusted the banker, trusted the paperwork. Green River. The name surfaced slowly. The same name Daniel had mentioned once at dinner, decades ago. They're pushing hard, he had said, tapping his fork lightly against his plate. Buying up land cheap before folks realize what they're worth. She hadn't asked more. He had changed the subject. Now she saw the pattern forming in ink and paper. She lifted the transfer agreement closer to the light filtering through the vines. The cabin parcel was listed separately from the surrounding acreage. It had been marked as inactive in the acquisition summary. Inactive. That word rang hollow in her ears. Ranger shifted closer. His nose brushed her wrist gently. She placed a hand on his head without looking away from the page. This wasn't sold, she murmured. Her voice sounded different now. Not uncertain, measured. She reached back into the box and pulled out another survey map. This one outlined a much larger tract of land. The same tract that years later would house the suburban development where her own home stood. Her breath caught. The edges aligned. Morgan Hollow acreage had been folded into the broader development blueprint. Except this cabin parcel. It had been left behind, intentionally or not. She leaned back against the stone hearth and let the weight of it settle. Daniel hadn't signed. He hadn't agreed to something. And shortly after that, he'd withdrawn from the partnership altogether. She remembered the tension in those years, the late-night phone calls, the way he would stare at paperwork without explaining it. Then his sudden decision to simplify, sell off assets, move into steady consulting work. She had believed it was just age, just fatigue. But what if it had been pressure? Her stomach tightened again, not from fear this time, from disbelief. She flipped back through the ledger. More notes. Appraisal undervalued by 18%. Bulk contract assumes inactive parcels. Verify exclusion clause. She stopped breathing for a moment. Bulk contract assumes inactive parcels. her suburban home, to Evans refinancing, debt consolidation tied to development assets. The pieces didn't fit neatly yet, but they touched. She set the papers down carefully, aligning them in a neat stack. Ranger lay down beside her, finally relaxing his posture. His job, it seemed, had been to make her look. She stared at the open hatch. The hollow outside remained quiet. No trucks on the distant road. No neighbors. No sound, except the faint shifting of vines against siding. She felt anger rise slowly. Not loud, not explosive, controlled. Daniel had carried this alone. Whatever irregularity he had discovered, whatever appraisal discrepancy he had questioned, he had never told her the full story. Perhaps he meant to protect her. Perhaps he thought it would pass. She closed the steel box gently and set it on the floor beside her. Her life had collapsed under paperwork she hadn't read closely. Now paperwork was sitting in her hands that might explain why. Ranger lifted his head and studied her face. "I think your nose is better than my lawyer's," she said softly. His tail thumped once against the floorboards. The cabin didn't feel abandoned anymore. It felt withheld. She rose slowly and carried the box to the small table against the wall. She laid the documents out flat to prevent further curling. Sunlight crept a little stronger through the vines as the morning progressed. Dust drifted in the beams like slow snow. She stood there, hands braced against the table, breathing evenly. $42. For a cabin someone had assumed would collapse quietly. For land someone had labeled inactive. For documents someone had hidden under floorboards. Ranger moved back to the center of the room and turned in a small circle before lying down, facing the door. Guarding. Marianne looked toward the front windows. Somewhere beyond those trees, the world kept moving. Paperwork kept shifting hands. Deals kept being signed. But here, in this cold, vine-bound cabin, something had stayed unfinished. And now she was holding it. The disbelief settled into something steadier. This cabin was not an accident, and Daniel had not walked away from Morgan Hollow without reason. She gathered the papers into a folder from her suitcase and slid them carefully inside. Tomorrow, she would go into town. She would ask questions. But for now, she stood in the quiet cabin, feeling the weight of truth that should not exist. And Ranger rested his head on his paws, satisfied. Marianne didn't sleep much that night. The papers lay stacked beside her suitcase, wrapped in an old sweater for protection. Every time the cabin creaked, she half expected the hatch to close itself again, or the wind to snatch the truth back under the floorboards. By morning, her mind had settled into something sharper. Anger. Not loud, not reckless. Focused. She brewed coffee over a small camping stove she'd kept in the trunk for road trips. The smell filled the main room, cutting through the damp wood scent. Ranger watched her movements closely, his tail brushing the floor once when she handed him a small piece of jerky from her bag. "We're going into town," she told him. He stood before she finished the sentence. The road out of Morgan Hollow looked less menacing in daylight. Still narrow, still uneven, but no longer mysterious. The courthouse annex was quiet on a weekday morning. A few cars in the gravel lot. A flag hanging limp in the still air. Marianne carried the folder under her arm as if it were fragile glass. Inside, the building smelled like old file cabinets and brewed coffee that had been sitting too long. A receptionist pointed her toward the county records office at the end of the hallway. Behind a waist-high counter sat a young man with dark hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He couldn't have been more than 30. "Can I help you?" he asked, polite but distracted. She set the folder on the counter. "I need to cross-check some property records for Morgan Hollow. Parcel 27. He blinked. "That area is mostly inactive." "So I've been told." He typed quickly, the keyboard clicking under his fingers. "Name?" he asked. "Marianne Caldwell." He paused, then typed again. The screen reflected faintly in his glasses. "Well," he said slowly, "Parcel 27 is listed as inactive during the 1998 bulk acquisition." She didn't move. "By Green River Development Group?" she asked. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Yes, that's correct." "Why inactive?" He scrolled. "There's a note here. Excluded pending appraisal verification." Her jaw tightened. Was that verification ever completed? He leaned closer to the screen. "Doesn't look like it. The parcel remains separate, never formally folded into the acquisition." She slid the ledger across the counter and opened it to Daniel's notes. "This handwriting belongs to my husband," she said evenly. "Daniel Caldwell." The clerk's posture shifted. "I'm Tomas Alvarez," he said quietly. "Junior records clerk." He studied the page. "These appraisal numbers," he murmured. "They don't match the acquisition totals." "That's what he wrote," Marianne replied. Tomas turned to his computer again, pulling up archived digital scans. "Green River acquired nearly 3,200 acres that year," he said. "The Hollow was part of that region. But Parcel 27, he frowned. "It was flagged." "Flagged how?" "Valuation discrepancy. Someone marked it as undervalued compared to adjacent parcels." Marianne felt the anger solidify. Daniel had questioned it. He had refused to sign. "What happened after that?" she asked. Tomas hesitated. "There's a note in the file," he said carefully. "A follow-up memo. It states Mr. Caldwell withdrew from partnership negotiations shortly after." Her breath caught. "Withdrew," she repeated. "Yes. Voluntary departure." Voluntary. She almost laughed. Daniel had come home exhausted that year, quieter than usual. He'd said the business was shifting directions, that he wanted out before it became something he didn't recognize. She hadn't pushed. "Who handled the refinancing package for the subdivision built afterward?" she asked. Tomas clicked through more records. "Green River's subsidiary, GR Asset Holdings. Same parent group." Her suburban home had been refinanced under a bundled debt structure tied to GR Asset Holdings. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the counter. "They later acquired residential mortgages in that development," Tomas added, "including several through debt consolidation programs." Her house, folded into the same network. It wasn't coincidence anymore. It was pattern. Tomas leaned back slightly. "Mrs. Caldwell, are you suggesting something improper?" "I'm suggesting," she said calmly, "that my husband refused to sign a deal because he believed the land was undervalued. That parcel was left inactive. Years later, my home, built on land acquired in that same deal, was refinanced into a structure controlled by the same development group." The silence between them thickened. Tomas removed his glasses and wiped them slowly. "There's no record of formal investigation into the appraisal discrepancy," he said. "It was simply marked unresolved." Unresolved, just like Daniel's silence. Ranger shifted beside her leg, sensing the tension. Marianne placed her hand lightly on his head. I'd like certified copies of all documents related to Parcel 27, she said. Tomas nodded. I can request them from archives. It may take a day or two. I'll wait. He studied her for a moment. You're not asking about financial restitution, he said carefully. Not yet, she replied. Her voice carried something new now. Not humiliation. Not disbelief. Purpose. Tomas printed preliminary summaries and slid them across the counter. I don't know what happened back then, he said, but sometimes inactive parcels are where mistakes hide. Marianne folded the papers neatly. Mistakes, she said quietly, or decisions. Outside, the courthouse bell chimed the hour. She stepped back into the sunlight with Ranger at her side. The air felt different now, clearer. She looked toward the road that led back to Morgan Hollow. This cabin had not been forgotten by accident. Daniel had resisted something, and that resistance had rippled forward in ways she had never seen. The anger inside her was no longer abstract. It had shape, it had names, and it had records. Ranger glanced up at her as they reached the car. We're not done, she told him softly. His ears lifted. Neither of them looked back at the courthouse. They drove toward the hollow, toward the vine-covered cabin that had been labeled inactive, toward the place Daniel had refused to surrender. And this time, Marianne felt something stronger than disbelief. She felt ready. The drive back to Morgan Hollow passed in a steady blur of late morning light and long shadows cast by bare trees. Marianne's grip on the steering wheel was firm, but no longer uncertain. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat this time, watching the road, watching her. She didn't head straight for the cabin. Instead, she followed a side road Tomas had mentioned before she left. Harold Boone still lives out by the old mill road, he had said quietly. He partnered with your husband once, retired now. The old mill road was narrower than the hollow entrance, gravel popping beneath her tires, fences leaning inward from years of weather. A rusted mailbox with Boone hand-painted across the front stood crooked near the ditch. She pulled into the yard slowly. The house was modest. White siding weathered gray at the edges. A wide porch with 2 rocking chairs and a stack of split firewood against the wall. An older man stepped out before she reached the steps. He moved slowly but steadily, broad shoulders softened by age, a worn flannel shirt tucked neatly into faded jeans, his hair white, cut short. He studied her without speaking. Mr. Boone? She asked gently. He nodded once. I'm Marianne Caldwell. His eyes changed at the name. Daniel's wife, he said quietly. She swallowed. Yes. He stepped aside without invitation, but without hesitation either. You'd better come in, he said. The inside of the house smelled of pine cleaner and wood smoke. Photographs lined the walls. Old logging crews, trucks loaded with timber, men posing beside freshly cut beams. Harold gestured toward the kitchen table. Ranger stayed close to Marianne's side but did not wander. He watched Harold carefully, assessing. I heard Daniel passed some years back, Harold said, as he poured coffee into 2 thick ceramic mugs. Heart, wasn't it? Yes, she replied. Harold nodded slowly. He was a stubborn man, he said. In a good way. Marianne set the folder on the table and opened it. I found documents, she said evenly. About Morgan Hollow. Parcel 27. Harold's jaw tightened almost immediately. He didn't reach for the papers. He didn't need to. That place, he muttered. He refused to sign the acquisition, she continued. Harold let out a long breath. They undervalued it, he said flatly. Whole stretch of land along that ridge. Timber quality was better than the appraisals suggested. Did Daniel know that? He proved it, Harold replied. Ran independent estimates. Brought in an outside surveyor. Marianne leaned forward. And? And Green River didn't like that. The room grew still. They were buying up acreage cheap, Harold continued. Promised infrastructure, development, steady returns. But Daniel wouldn't sign off once he saw the numbers were off. Said it was wrong. She felt the anger tighten again. What happened after? Pressure, Harold said simply. Meetings, calls, offers to increase his buyout if he'd stop questioning the valuation. And he refused. Harold gave a short nod. He refused. The ticking of a wall clock filled the pause between them. Did he ever tell you? Harold asked quietly. No, she said. Harold stared down at the wood grain of the table. He didn't want trouble following you, he said. Or Evan. Her throat tightened. Trouble did follow, she said softly. Years later. Harold's eyes met hers. The refinancing? She nodded. I signed papers I shouldn't have. Harold rubbed his hands together slowly. I can't prove retaliation, he said. But Green River's subsidiaries were aggressive. If someone refused cooperation, they found other leverage. Marianne felt the words land heavy. They consolidated assets, she murmured, including residential properties. Harold leaned back in his chair. Daniel withdrew completely after that, he said. Sold off what he could. Wanted out before it turned ugly. She closed her eyes briefly. He hadn't left the partnership because he was tired. He had stepped away because he wouldn't bend, and she had never known. When he walked away, Harold added, Green River marked Parcel 27 inactive, said it wasn't worth the paperwork fight. Inactive. She felt the weight of that word again. And now, Harold said slowly, you're living there? I bought it at auction, she replied. He stared at her in disbelief. For how much? $42. A rough laugh escaped him. They thought it would rot, he said. Ranger shifted at her side, tail brushing the floor once. They assumed no one would look, Marianne replied. Harold's expression grew more serious. You need to be careful, he said. They still own adjacent parcels, forestry access, mineral rights. She nodded. I'm not trying to start a fight, she said. You already are, Harold replied gently, just by reopening it. The air in the kitchen felt heavier now. But I can't ignore it, she said. Daniel didn't. Harold studied her carefully. No, he agreed. He didn't. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with history. You'll need documentation, Harold continued. Proof that Parcel 27 was excluded deliberately. I have the ledger, the unsigned agreement. That's a start, he said. But you'll need certified records and public visibility. Public visibility. The idea settled slowly. She hadn't thought that far. She had only thought about truth. Harold stood and walked to a cabinet near the sink. He pulled out a faded folder and returned to the table. I kept copies, he said quietly, just in case. He slid several photocopied appraisal reports across the table. The discrepancies were clear. Undervalued timber density, misclassified soil quality, errors too consistent to be random. Marianne's anger deepened into something steadier. This hadn't been a misunderstanding. It had been intentional. "Why didn't you pursue it?" she asked. Harold looked down at his hands. "Daniel stepped away," he said. "And I had a family to protect." The honesty in his voice left no room for judgment. Ranger lifted his head and studied Harold for a moment, then lowered it again. Marianne gathered the copies carefully. "I won't let it stay buried," she said quietly. Harold gave a slow nod. "You sound like him," he said. That landed differently. She stood, folder secured under her arm. As she stepped onto the porch, the wind moved through the trees with a low whisper. Ranger paused at the top step and looked back at Harold once before following her down. The drive back to Morgan Hollow felt shorter. The cabin appeared at the end of the road, vines still clinging, roof sagging under the weight of years. But it no longer looked abandoned. It looked contested. Marianne stepped out of the car and stood for a moment, looking at the porch. Daniel had refused to sign. He had walked away rather than compromise. And decades later, the pressure had found its way to her doorstep. She exhaled slowly. This was no accident. The foreclosure that stripped her home may not have been random misfortune. It may have been a long echo. Ranger stood beside her, steady. The hollow remained quiet. But Marianne understood something now. The cabin had been left behind deliberately, and the people who left it believed no one would return. They were wrong. Marianne stood on the uneven porch for a long moment after that thought passed through her. The wind moved lightly through the trees above Morgan Hollow, carrying the dry scent of bark and old leaves. Ranger stayed at her side, posture steady, eyes scanning the edge of the tree line. The cabin no longer felt fragile. It felt watched. She spent the afternoon inside, organizing the documents Harold had given her alongside Daniel's ledger. She cleared a section of the warped table near the window and laid the appraisal reports out carefully, smoothing the corners flat. The numbers lined up. The undervaluation wasn't a clerical mistake. It was systematic. Ranger shifted positions occasionally, but he kept returning to the doorway, lying down with his body angled outward, guarding the threshold. Late afternoon light slanted through gaps in the vines, stretching long shadows across the floorboards. Marianne had just finished stacking the papers into labeled sections when she heard it. A vehicle. Not close yet, but distinct. The hum of tires grinding over gravel carried up the logging road. Ranger's head snapped up instantly. His body stiffened, not aggressive, but alert. Marianne stood slowly. She walked toward the front window and carefully moved a vine aside just enough to see down the road. A white county SUV emerged between the trees. Her pulse slowed rather than quickened. "Already?" she murmured. The vehicle stopped near the base of the porch. The engine idled for a moment before cutting off. A man stepped out. Tall, lean, mid-40s perhaps. Dark jacket with a county patch on the sleeve. Clipboard tucked under one arm. Victor Shaw. She didn't know his name yet, but she recognized the posture. The kind of stance that carried authority without warmth. Ranger moved in front of her before she reached the door, not blocking her, just positioning himself between her and whatever stood outside. She placed a steady hand on his back. "It's all right," she said quietly. She opened the door before Shaw could knock. The hollow air shifted slightly between them. "Mrs. Caldwell?" he asked, glancing at the clipboard. "Yes." "I'm Victor Shaw, County Compliance Officer." His eyes flicked briefly toward Ranger. "I've received a structural hazard complaint regarding this property." "From whom?" she asked calmly. He didn't answer that. "Reports of unsafe occupancy, possible environmental risks." The words were measured, clinical. Marianne stepped onto the porch. "This property was purchased legally at county auction," she said evenly. "Yes," Shaw replied. "However, that does not exempt it from inspection." Ranger stood at her side, shoulders squared but silent. His gaze remained locked on Shaw, ears forward, tail still. "I'm not refusing inspection," she said. "You're welcome to assess the structure." Shaw nodded once and climbed the steps. The wood creaked under his weight. Inside, he moved slowly, scanning the ceiling beams, the floorboards, the fireplace. "You've removed a plank," he observed, pointing toward the open hatch. "Yes." "For what purpose?" "Structural evaluation," she replied without hesitation. He crouched near the opening and examined the steel box, now empty and set aside. "Any mold assessment completed?" he asked. "It's dry beneath the hatch," she said. "The area has remained sealed." He stood and walked toward the hallway. Ranger followed at a measured distance, positioning himself between Shaw and Marianne whenever the space narrowed. "Keep your dog under control," Shaw said mildly. "He is under control," Marianne replied. Ranger did not growl. He did not bark. He simply existed in the space as a quiet boundary. Shaw moved back into the main room and made notes on his clipboard. "This structure shows signs of deterioration," he said. "Water intrusion, compromised flooring. You may be required to vacate pending formal review." Marianne met his gaze steadily. "Based on what standard?" she asked. He paused. "Structural safety." "I've reviewed county records," she continued calmly. "This parcel was marked inactive during the 1998 bulk acquisition. It has remained separate from adjacent development properties." A flicker crossed Shaw's expression. Brief, controlled. "That's unrelated to current safety compliance," he replied. "Is it?" she asked. Silence lingered between them. Outside, the trees moved faintly in the breeze. Shaw finished writing and tore a sheet from his pad. "This is a preliminary notice," he said. "Further evaluation may follow." He handed it to her. She took it without lowering her eyes. "Someone assumed this place would collapse quietly," she said. "It hasn't." He studied her for a moment longer. "Ensure it doesn't," he replied. Then he turned and stepped off the porch. Ranger remained still until the SUV engine started again. The vehicle backed down the logging road and disappeared between the trees. The hollow returned to silence. Marianne stood holding the inspection notice. Her anger from earlier had shifted again. Not disbelief, not awakening, determination. This wasn't coincidence. The adjacent parcels still belonged to Green River's subsidiary. They likely assumed Parcel 27 would decay into irrelevance. Instead, it had resurfaced. Ranger nudged her hand gently. She looked down at him. "They thought it would rot," she said softly. "They thought no one would look twice." He blinked up at her, calm and unwavering. She walked back inside and set the notice on the table beside the ledgers. The papers did not feel fragile anymore. They felt like evidence. Outside, the sun dipped lower behind the ridge. The vine-covered cabin stood quiet, no longer hidden, and for the first time since she'd driven away from her old driveway, Marianne did not feel displaced. She felt anchored. The pressure was no longer invisible. It had a face, and it had made a move. So would she. The next morning, Marianne drove into town again. The inspection notice folded neatly beside Daniel's ledger on the passenger seat. Ranger rode upright, eyes steady on the road ahead. The courthouse annex felt different now, less intimidating, more like a place built of paper and memory. Tomas looked up when she approached the counter. He recognized her immediately. "They moved quickly," he said quietly, glancing at the notice in her hand. "They're worried," she replied. He adjusted his glasses. Compliance officers don't usually visit inactive parcels unless prompted. "By whom?" He hesitated. "Green River's subsidiary still owns adjacent tracts," he said carefully. "Any structural instability could complicate development plans." Marianne placed the appraisal reports Harold had given her on the counter. "These numbers were altered," she said. "Parcel 27 was undervalued to smooth the bulk acquisition." Tomas studied the pages. "If that's documented publicly," he said slowly, "it changes the narrative." "I want it documented," she replied. He nodded. "There's a zoning review next week," he said. "Green River has filed preliminary adjustments for boundary realignment in the hollow. If this discrepancy is entered into the record before then, it forces disclosure." "Entered how?" "A formal correction request, supported by certified copies." She slid Daniel's ledger forward. "This enough?" Tomas exhaled softly. "It's more than enough." The process took hours. Copies stamped, forms signed, attachments logged. Ranger lay quietly at Marianne's feet the entire time, occasionally lifting his head when voices rose near the front desk. By afternoon, Tomas leaned back in his chair. "It's in the system," he said. "Once it hits the public docket, it's searchable." "Public," she repeated. "Yes." That evening, a small-town reporter named Claire Jensen called her cell phone. Tomas had tipped her off. "I'd like to verify a record correction filed this morning," Claire said, her tone professional but curious. Marianne agreed to meet her at the cabin. When Claire arrived, she stepped out of her compact sedan with a notebook already open. She was in her 30s, hair tied back in a loose knot, boots dusty from the gravel road. "This is the parcel?" she asked, taking in the vine-covered porch. "Yes." Ranger stood at Marianne's side but remained calm. Claire stepped carefully onto the porch. "I've covered Green River acquisitions for years," she said quietly. "But this suggests a flagged discrepancy that was never resolved." "It wasn't resolved," Marianne replied. "It was buried." Claire glanced at the steel box resting near the open hatch. "May I?" Marianne nodded. Claire flipped through copies of the surveys, the unsigned transfer agreement, Daniel's notes in the margins. Her eyebrows rose. "This is substantial," she murmured. "Will you print it?" Marianne asked. Claire met her gaze. "If the records are verified, which they are, it's public interest." 2 days later, the article ran online and in the weekly print edition. Headline: "Inactive Parcel Raises Questions." In 1998, Green River Acquisition. The piece detailed the undervaluation, the exclusion of Parcel 27, the subsequent refinancing network tied to GR Asset Holdings, and the pending zoning review. By afternoon, Tomas called. They've withdrawn their boundary adjustment request, he said. That fast? They don't want further scrutiny. Marianne sat at the table inside the cabin, newspapers spread in front of her. Have they addressed the parcel discrepancy? She asked. Officially, no, Tomas replied. But they've halted adjacent claims pending internal review. She hung up slowly. Outside, the hollow felt quieter than usual. Not heavy, just watchful. The following week, additional documentation surfaced through public records, internal memos acknowledging the flagged valuation. Nothing overtly criminal, but enough to suggest deliberate oversight. Under scrutiny, Green River's subsidiary formally withdrew any claims or development plans touching Morgan Hollow's disputed boundary. The refinance structure that had absorbed her suburban home underwent review. Misfiled liens were identified. The financial burden that had been tied directly to her name was reassessed. The house itself would not return, but the liability attached to it cleared. One afternoon, Harold drove up the logging road in his old pickup. He stepped out slowly, studying the cabin. Never thought I'd see that company retreat, he said. They didn't retreat, Marianne replied. They stepped back. Ranger stood between them, tail sweeping the ground once. Harold nodded toward the porch. You did what Daniel couldn't finish, he said. She looked toward the vines wrapped around the railings. No, she said softly. I just refused to ignore it. Claire's article gained quiet traction across the county. No dramatic scandal, no lawsuits, just acknowledgement, and sometimes acknowledgement was enough. That evening, Marianne sat on the porch steps with Ranger stretched across the doorway behind her. The sun dipped low beyond the trees, casting long bands of gold through the hollow. The vines along the cabin walls stirred gently in the breeze. The inspection notice remained pinned to the inside wall, never escalated. Parcel 27 was no longer labeled inactive in the system. It was active, documented, visible. Ranger lifted his head as if sensing the shift in air. She reached back and ran her fingers through his fur. They tried to bury it, she said quietly. His tail tapped once. The hollow did not swallow sound tonight. It carried it. And the cabin, once assumed to collapse quietly, stood firm against the ridge. The truth had surfaced, and it had changed the shape of everything around it. And it had changed the shape of everything around it. Spring came slowly to Morgan Hollow. First, the snowmelt loosened the road, turning the gravel slick and dark. Then the frost lifted from the ground in uneven patches, revealing green beneath brown. The vines wrapped around the cabin softened, their brittle grip easing as new shoots began to push through. Marianne stood on the porch one early morning with a pair of pruning shears in her hand. Ranger sat beside her, watching. She clipped carefully at the thickest coils first. Each cut released the wood beneath, weathered but solid. The porch rails weren't as damaged as they had appeared. The beams Daniel had once helped reinforce were still straight. She ran her palm along one exposed post. It held. The inspection notice remained pinned inside, untouched. Victor Shaw had not returned. Green River's subsidiary filed a brief statement weeks earlier, citing administrative review of historical parcels. No further action taken. Tomas had called to confirm what the financial review uncovered. Several liens associated with your suburban mortgage were misfiled under consolidated asset groups, he had explained. Your personal liability has been cleared. The foreclosure stands, but the debt obligation does not. The house in the subdivision would not be hers again. But the burden that had followed her name was gone. That mattered. Harold visited twice that spring, once to bring a small load of firewood, once to sit on the porch and talk about Daniel. He'd argue with anyone who bent numbers, Harold said one afternoon, rocking slowly in the repaired chair. Drove them crazy. Marianne smiled faintly. He never argued with me, she said. That's because he didn't need to, Harold replied. Ranger lay stretched across the threshold, half inside, half out. No longer tense, no longer listening for engines on the road. Just resting. The hollow sounded different in spring. Birdsong returned. Water ran faintly in the low ditch beyond the trees. Wind moved through new leaves instead of scraping dead vines across siding. One evening, Marianne stood alone on the porch as the sun lowered behind the ridge. The valley no longer swallowed sound. It carried it. She could hear her own breathing, the distant rustle of branches, the soft thump of Ranger's tail against the wooden floor behind her. She leaned against the porch rail, the same rail that had once been hidden beneath choking vines. $42. The figure no longer felt ironic. It felt precise. She hadn't regained her suburban home. She hadn't reversed the past, but she had uncovered something that was meant to remain unseen. Daniel's refusal, the flagged discrepancy, the deliberate exclusion, the quiet pressure that followed. The truth had not shouted. It had waited under a weak board, guarded by a dog who refused to ignore what he sensed. Ranger stepped up beside her now, pressing his shoulder lightly against her thigh, the way he had in the driveway the day the locks changed. She placed her hand on his head. "I thought I lost everything," she said quietly. He blinked up at her and she looked out over the hollow. The cabin stood behind her, no longer vine-bound, no longer inactive. It wasn't revenge that kept her there. It wasn't defiance. It was steadiness. Some structures collapse quietly. Some are stripped bare and forgotten. And some, even when left behind, refuse to fall because someone finally chooses to look closely. Marianne listened to the wind move through the valley without swallowing it. The sound carried across the trees and came back to her. Ranger lowered himself onto the porch boards and stretched out fully, chin resting on his paws. At ease. The house that once locked her out no longer defined her. This one did, not because it was grand, but because it had endured.
And so had she. Marianne stayed there a long time, her hand resting on Ranger's head, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. The hollow wasn't silent anymore. It was alive in small ways, birds settling, wind sifting through new leaves, the old beam holding their sap under evening light. The day the lock changed, she thought she'd been erased, not just from a house, but from her old story. Like paperwork couldn't rewrite her life if it was stamped hard enough. But standing her now, she understood something she hadn't before. Daniel hadn't lost, he has refilled. And she hadn't been ruled out of everything. She had been pushed toward the one thing no one finished. Ranger hadn't found treasure, he hadn't found revenge. He just wouldn't leave that weak board alone. Any other person might step over it, cut it wrap wood, move on. Not strength, not money, just the stubbornness to stop and look where everyone else tells you not to. Marianne looked back at the cabin, the one they made in until, like it didn't matter. Then she looked out at the bridge where the sun was slipping down. How many things in our own life get labeled inactive because it's easier that way? How many weak boys have we worked abroad without ever knocking on them? Ranger let out a short breath and closed his eye. The hollow didn't swallow that sound. It carried it, and this time so did she.